Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world, everyone. My name is Aliou Gambrel. I'm a senior at Cornell University, studying Africana Studies and College Scholar. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to our roundtable on migration in the media. I would like to first thank the sponsors who made this event possible, including the Migrations Initiative. And this event is also co-sponsored by the East Asia Program, the Institute for European Studies, the Department of Sociology, Latin America and Caribbean Studies, and the School of Public Policy. Before we begin, it is important that we acknowledge that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gaekono, or the Cayuga Nation. The Gaekono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gaekono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gaekono people, past, present, and future, to these lands and waters. The 2 co-moderators for this event are Andrea Bachner, who is a professor of comparative literature and the director of the East Asia program at Cornell. Her work explores comparative intersections between Sinophone, Latin American, and European cultural productions in dialogue with theories of interculturality, sexuality, and mediality. Our second moderator is Eleanor Painter, who is a postdoc associate in the Migrations Institute at Cornell University's Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies. Her work in critical refugee studies focuses on Africa to Europe migration and displacement and asylum in the Mediterranean. Her current book project, Emergency in Transit, engages a range of media representations of migration and draws on oral, visual, and written testimonies by migrants in Italy to challenge the crisis framing of border crossings. I'm looking forward to seeing the discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much to Aliou for this welcome, and thanks to all of you for being here. And many thanks also to our colleagues working behind the scenes to make this event possible today. Let's start our conversation with an image.
What you see here is a photograph of Ai Weiwei's 2016 art installation Safe Passage at the concert hall in Berlin. The building's columns are covered with thousands of life vests worn by refugees, many from Syria, during their perilous sea journey from Turkey to Greece. The installation brings physical vestiges of the drama of the dangerous crossing from elsewhere, the Mediterranean, in this case, to the heart of places such as Berlin, or for another installation, also Minnesota, that refugees aim for as safe havens. But where are the bodies living and dead that wore these vests? What are the individual stories? And what does it mean that these vests, having granted at best a precarious safe passage to refugees, are now here in an image, part of an art installation for us to see?
Images such as these confront us head-on with the importance and the challenge of representing migration, especially at a moment of hyper-politicized border and migration issues. We're constantly consuming stories about migration in daily news coverage, on social media, and through the many documentary films and visual art that represent these issues for broader publics. As we encounter coverage of migration and refugee and migrant and refugee experiences across a range of media, what do these images and stories tell us? How do they shape what we know about key issues? And how do we react to these representations? And for scholars, journalists, practitioners, and others, what are our responsibilities in representing, mediating, and communicating migration? How do we convey the significance of numbers, of deaths or arrivals or deportation numbers, for example? How do we spread awareness of migrant issues without sensationalizing this suffering or oversimplifying people's experiences? Who is telling these stories? Whose stories are we not hearing? And how can such representations impact audiences and potentially affect real change?
This roundtable conversation with scholars, journalists, and practitioners offers a space for a conversation around the multiple questions, issues, and practices involved in understanding how stories are crafted and communicated. We will now briefly introduce our panelists in the order in which they will present and speak. From their different positions with their different perspectives, they are all actively documenting, producing, circulating, and reflecting on migration stories in a range of different media. In what follows, they will share from their own work, focusing especially on the contentious border spaces of the southern US and southern Europe. Each speaker will offer short comments on how they approach the question of representing migration issues or experiences and about what critical perspectives are especially useful for us as media consumers. Our goal is first to give space to the range of work they are about to share with us. Then we will give panelists a chance to be in dialogue with each other and also to take questions from the audience. Please use the chat feature to ask questions throughout our discussion.
So introducing the panelists in order, first we'll hear from Krista Lines, who's Canada Research Chair in Feminist Media Studies and Associate Professor in Communication Studies at Concordia University. They're co-directing the Feminist Media Studio, which provides a space for media creation and critical engagement with intersectional and gender-based forms of oppression and exploitation. They're the author of Prismatic Media, Transnational Circuits, Feminism in a Globalized Present, and co-editor of the open access anthology, Moving Images, Mediating Migration as Crisis. Their current research project, Greenhouse Effects, the Mediation of Life and the Migration of Labor, seeks to explore how greenhouses have been a central infrastructure for the racialized, classed, and gendered global movement of humans, plants, animals, knowledge, and culture over the last several centuries and today. Following Krista, we'll hear from Katie Fallon, who's a freelance journalist based in Athens and who's joining us today from Kos, and who focuses on migration at the EU's external borders. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Al Jazeera English, and The Independent. She's also working across media, for instance, contributing recently to a radio program covering the aftermath of the fire that destroyed the Moria asylum seeker camp on the Greek island of Lesbos almost exactly 1 year ago. Then we'll hear from three speakers who represent the Refocus Media Labs Foundation, which provides refugees in Greece with media creation skills and which in 2019 produced Even After Death, a feature documentary made by refugees. So we'll be hearing from Nazanin Froghi, a native of Afghanistan who earned her Bachelor of Educational Science from Tehran University. Currently residing on Lesbos, Greece, Ms. Froghi is a senior member of Refocus Media Lab's photojournalism program. She's contributed to reports on the refugee crisis in Greece with mainstream international partners, including Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, BBC Newsnight, DR, Guardian, and SBS Dateline. Douglas Herman, a co-founder of Refocus, currently serves as its educational and creative director. He's a veteran media arts teacher and artist from New York who pioneered the career in technical education film and video program at the Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, and founded the nonprofit Rough Cut Productions with his students. In 2019, Douglas directed Even After Death. He was honored with the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching, named an Extraordinary Cinematic Arts Teacher by Studio School in Los Angeles, and was a featured speaker at TEDx Penn State in 2018. And Sonia Nanzik-Herman, co-founder and CEO of Refocus, is a humanitarian and an activist. She earned master's degrees in sociology from the University of Silesia and in international relations from the Jagiellonian University. Before entering the humanitarian sector and working in Serbia, Greece, and Bangladesh, Sonia worked for the European Parliament. She specializes in the refugee crisis and human rights advocacy, and she's a producer of Even After Death.
After the Refocus group folks, Molly O'Toole will share some of her insights. She is a fall 2021 Subro Distinguished Visiting Journalist Fellow in Cornell's College of Arts and Sciences. She's an immigration and security reporter based normally in the Los Angeles Times, Washington, D.C. bureau. She was awarded the first ever Pulitzer Prize in audio reporting in 2020 with the staff of This American Life and freelancer Emily Green for The Outcrowd, investigating the personal impact of the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy on asylum officers and asylum seekers. She was also a 2020 finalist for the Livingston Awards for Excellence in International Reporting. Then we'll hear from Robert Irwin, who is Professor of Spanish and Deputy Director of the Global Migration Center at UC Davis. He's a specialist in Mexican and Mexican American cultural history and in gender, migration, and media studies. Among his publications are Mexican Masculinities and the Dictionary of Latin American Cultural Studies, and forthcoming, the Humanizing Deportation Project, Migrant Feelings, Migrant Knowledge. Since 2016, he has coordinated the digital storytelling project Humanizing Deportation. And our last speaker for today will be Tanvi Misra, who is an independent writer and multimedia journalist based in Queens, New York. She covers migration, urban policy, and criminal justice. Her writing and radio work has appeared in The Atlantic, Bloomberg, City Lab, The Baffler, The Guardian, NBC News, Teen Vogue, The Verge, Roll Call, NPR, and BBC, among others. Her writing ranges from award-winning long-form features and investigations to essays and policy analysis. She's originally from India and, apart from the United States, has reported in the UK, France, and Germany. Welcome to this exciting panel. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your insights. I hand it now over to our first speaker, Krista Lines.
Thank you, Andrea and Eleanor, for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this incredible group of speakers. I'm speaking to you here from the unceded lands of the Ganyan-Gahaga Nation in Tiohtià:ke in Montreal. And the comments that I'm going to give today are about mediating migration around the question of representing movement, because how one represents movement is really fundamental to how we conceive of migration. And particularly the way movement is mediated has been, I think, a linchpin in mediating migration as a form of crisis. Right. So I'm going to show you two clips and talk a little bit about them and talk a little over them as a way of proposing a predicament for representing movement within mass media forms and other cultural forms, art forms. This first image that you're seeing is an installation by the artist Bushra Khalili called the Mapping Journey Project. It includes, we're seeing one of the suspended screens, but there are 4 suspended screens in the gallery space with projections on either side. And each projection uses a map as a kind of prop for one person to narrate the itinerary of their journey. The map fills the entire screen, and the viewer also sees a hand or a pair of hands drawing out the path of their movement as they tell the story of how they traveled from one station to the next on their journey. Khalili chose to record each journey in one long shot, and only to include the hand and the marker. And she stresses that it's a permanent marker and that this is politically important for her about redrawing the lines on the map with a permanent marker. What we see as we watch and sit and watch these 8 different narratives is the erratic and wayward nature of each's journey, the obstacles that each faced, that are charted as detours or zigzags, advances and returns. As each person narrates their own journey, their pen work slows down as they tell the story of traveling over land and speeds up as they embark on flights. Khalili chooses a different global map for each narration. So it's important that the countries are actually different colors, their typographical conventions and their fonts are distinct. And she does this to refuse a common imaginary, a common world across the 8 stories. And this is part of the really potent political lessons that Bushra Khalili teaches us in and through this project. So I'll come back at the end of my comments to why I think this strategy is so important and so potent. But before that, I want to detour into a second clip, which deals with the way in which migration is much more commonly represented as a particular kind of movement. So in the post-2015 period, in the European context, a number of agencies, design agencies, engaged in animating migration data through data visualizations. And very often these data visualizations really sensationalized the crisis and helped to foster xenophobic sentiments. And they did so by really representing migration as a series of flows or waves. And this example is a design lab called Lucify. And they call themselves a design lab that helps organize, visualize, understand, and communicate important data and models. This project animates data from the UNHCR to create a map, as you can see, of little specks of light traveling like swarms of insects towards increasing bar graphs on each country of Northern Europe. The Lucify say really plainly on their website that the routes and the travel times in their data visualization aren't accurate, but they say their animation nevertheless seeks to provide an intuitive grasp of the scale of the problem. The map in this case provides a key anchor for their data visualization, but it's also really interesting to think about how this map mediates movement. Trajectories of movement look like they're emerging out of specific territories around the globe, but they actually emerge from the center of the national territory because it's data, it's not an actual route traveled. The departure points on the maps are derived from tables of countries of origin and countries of arrival, not the coastal areas from which people actually depart. So we're not actually seeing actual migration routes here. What we're seeing here is animated data. And what we forget when we look at these data visualizations, which are used by Frontex, are used by UNHCR, are used by a number of agencies, is that they emanate from the same visual illusions as, for instance, PET scans and NASA images. They're visualizations of data, right? The routes that are traveled are not traveled, they're statistical averages. And what's frequently missing from these representations and these maps is the eccentricities of the journey, the personal whys, the rhythms, the frictions, the obstacles, the defeats. What's also missing are the deportations, other forms of movement that are not towards the EU, right? And so while this is a problem in representing migration as flows and as flows towards Europe through the visualization of data, it doesn't mean that there aren't mainstream accounts of individual journeys. But what I want to question in showing this is how even individual stories then come to follow and repeat the tropes that are present in this animation, right? These tropes in stories of a wave or a rush of people crossing borders, of points of entry, rather than the real and differential dynamics of movement, particularly from the global south to the global north. So the expansive and proliferating field visualizing global migration encompasses on the one end data about ports of entry, drownings at sea, migrant demographics, asylum claims, and on the other, humanitarian accounts of really singular, iconic stories of human drama. But they might be both two sides of the same coin, which actually come to represent migration as a crisis of movement, of hordes or flows towards Europe. And that's why I started with the work of Bushra Khalili, her Mapping Journey project, in which these 8 journeys are both profoundly singular and also profoundly collective. And they're indicative of how movement hangs together by a rope connecting an overcrowded Zodiac boat whose engine has flooded, and a multinational coalition of social justice workers and medical volunteers in the middle of the sea that holds together the cell phone making the distress call with the humanitarian and security dashboards that control and patrol international waters. They, in other words, highlight something of the agency and autonomy of those on the move and the different world they imagine through that very movement, as well as the structural and cultural forces that oppose and present obstacles to that movement. And I think this is something we really need to keep in mind as we're thinking about how movement is portrayed and mediated in these representational regimes. And I'll stop there and look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Crystal Lyons, and welcome to Katie Fallon.
Thank you very much. And I hope everyone can see me. I'm joining you from the Greek island of Kos, and the light is fading very quickly, but hopefully everyone can at least hear me. So I wanted to start today actually talking about Kos and the island of Samos, which is a Greek island nearby that I just came from. The island of Kos is very well known, at least to most of the British public, as being a holiday island. Outside the place I'm staying, there's many tavernas, there's tons of places for rental cars. It's a tourist trap, basically. And 20 minutes away from the main town of Kos is a refugee camp. If you drive up to it, you will see fences, barbed wire, surveillance systems, and lots of police. And so I wanted to start with this image to talk about the duality of places and the idea of labels. And so to move on from that to the island of Samos, which is also a very well-known tourist destination for Germans, at least. And if you take a car 10 minutes from the idyllic town of Vathi, which is based on the water, you will get to another refugee camp. Again, barbed wire, fences. And this is the new camp that was inaugurated this weekend and marks the first of 5 new refugee camps being built in the Aegean to host asylum seekers already living on the islands and arriving on the islands. So I wanted to talk about what stories need to be told. And I think for me, the most important thing is stories about people and recognizing the idea of conflicting truths. So the fact that one island can be a paradise for some is not always true for others. And this is something that I always find challenging in my work when I talk to friends and family from home who only recognize Greece as this very idyllic holiday place, which of course it is. But then it has another side to it, which is refugee camps, which have become notorious, infamous for their bad conditions, and places like Moria, which of course have burned down last year, and then a new camp got built, became synonymous with the quote-unquote migration crisis of 2015. Again, this is also a label as well, crisis. And so I think this is the sort of things that I try and think about when I am starting to write a piece. People are always, for me, the most important thing. Policies, even a piece about policies, is about people, because at the end of the day, even if it's a very specific article about European migration policies, it's always going to be about people at the sharp end of the stick, living in places like Lesbos, places like Kos, places like Samos. And the same is true for some of the reporting that I did in Calais, in northern France, which is not so much known for being a holiday destination, but is a place many Brits pass through on their way to France. It's also a place where you can take the ferry across from Dover to stock up, if you're a Brit, on tax-free alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also a place where many people come to try and seek asylum in the UK. And I think this is where it becomes really important to think about how you approach telling stories in these places too. And I think I always try and think about spending as much time as I can in these places, and also approaching a situation preparing to be surprised. I went to Calais, and of course you could see the images of the jungle, which has now been bulldozed and destroyed, but it was this kind of huge shanty town of people, and it was bulldozed in the end of 2016, and now there are still people sleeping rough in the woods. and who are trying to seek asylum in the UK. And for me, I would see journalists come. I spent some time in Calais for a couple of months, and they would know. I think the thing I always think is that no one owes you their story. So a story is never more important than the person you're talking to. And also prepare to be surprised and challenge your own expectations when you're reporting and when you're spending time is, I think, the thing that I found was that it was the lack of sometimes respect journalists would show to people. They would open their tents, shine torches in their eyes. And for me, I think that the story is never worth infringing upon people's personal spaces. And so this comes to the ideas of obstacles you confront. And this can be physical, can be literal obstacles here, such as the access to refugee camps, which is becoming increasingly difficult to get into because of the fact that they are increasingly controlled, increasingly policed, increasingly monitored. But it's also your own perception of the situation, and the idea of labels that come with being a refugee, with being an asylum seeker, and ultimately it's just people that you're talking to, which I know sounds a bit trite, but I think that sometimes we get lost in this idea of, yes, I'm talking about migration, yes, I specialize in that, but at the end of the day, for me, it's just writing stories about people and people's experiences. And I think when I was spending time in Calais, I spent a lot of time with a group of Eritrean teenagers, and they were probably the best footballers I've ever seen, and had dreams of being Marcus Rashford in Manchester United. And for me, the story about them playing football was far more important than any story anyone's written about their journey, the horrors they faced, because this was just normal kids, and that's what they were. And so what I wanted to come back to, I've started going on a tangent, is the fact that you can always be surprised. And I think moving forward, it will be more important. This is why I'm glad that Refocus are going to show, and Nazanin, is that people who have lived experience of these situations are also reporting on these situations. And I will just finish off with the idea that, as I mentioned at the beginning, one place can be many things, people can be many things, and you can always be surprised, and you can always learn more. And I think the most important thing for me is always knowing that I don't know enough. And anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Katie. And now I'll pass it along to the group from Refocus Media Labs.
Welcome, everybody. We are a three-person representation of Refocus Media Labs. My name is Sonia Nanji-Kerman, Doug, my husband and co-founder of Refocus Media Labs, and Nazanin, who is joining us from Lesbos. We are currently in Berlin presenting our exhibition also on reporting and on how refugees and asylum seekers can represent themselves in media. And everything started in 2018 when we created the Refocus Media Labs Foundation to give refugees and asylum seekers skills so they can showcase their work and enter job markets, European job markets, and also tell their own stories. It came from the fact from our travels, actually, wherever we went, we saw that there's a huge gap in humanitarian aid, namely education and skills-based training for young refugees, mostly late teenagers, young people who were basically forced into very harsh physical labor and couldn't train in those areas where they were very interested in, like media. So we decided to create a foundation that will allow them to do so. I will pass the floor now to Doug, who will tell you more how we are doing this.
It's a pleasure to be here with everyone and in such illustrious company. As Sonia was mentioning, our program is essentially future-centric. The map we saw at the opening really kind of talks a lot about the fear-mongering that is permeating our media ecostructures and leading a lot of people to fear the individuals that are seeking protections. And the reality is that they're actually seeking protections from the true monsters that they're fleeing, and yet they are being perceived as such. So our program was really centered on the idea of ignoring why they came to Greece, why they came to Lesbos, not even mentioning it, not even talking about it, and just providing them with a safe space for them to develop the skills and the opportunities and the confidence to move forward into their own respective futures. The exhibition behind us today, which is titled Trapped in the Playground, chronicles the last 2 years of experience of lived endurance on the island of Lesbos. Nazanin is a strong contributor to that exhibition, as well as a short film that we will soon premiere here in Gorky Theater in Berlin on the 11th of October, which is titled Nothing About Us Without Us. She's co-director along with one of our students and teachers, senior members, Yasser Akbari. And the film chronicles the reality of the way refugees feel about the way they're being portrayed in the media. So a lot of what Katie was saying is extremely relevant to the work that we do on a daily basis. But at its purest point, our program is about the safety of a space where young people can grow and can experience daily joy despite the challenges they face on the island and through this asylum process, which is extremely unfair and illegal. And I'd like to pass it to Nazanin because she should be speaking on her own behalf, not us the other way around. Nazanin, I think you're muted.
Okay, now. Yeah. So hi everyone. Okay. It's Nazanin Fouroughi. I'm from Afghanistan, and it's about 2 years that I'm living. I have been living in Lesbos Island. So because of the short time that we have, I will directly get into the this is how we started with the Citizen Journalism Project. All the Refocus team, we decided to start citizen journalism while we were trapped in Moria camp regarding to the lockdown that everyone faced in their own places. So we could see all over the world from the media, social media, that they are talking about how people should deal with the quarantine and how they should follow the protection rules because of the coronavirus. And they were showing how to wash your hands, how to keep your distance, but no one were talking about the refugees who are stuck in a big camp that there is not any basic needs provided. So they didn't talk about us. That's how we can wash our hands when there is not any water and there is not any hygiene products. How we are supposed to keep our distance while we don't have any privacy in our living area, and we need to stand in massive food lines for many hours. So it was a bit sad for all of us that we could see that's how the world has paid attention to all of these things. That's how people can manage their quarantine life while in the meantime that they are away from the society. But no one talked about the refugee people. That's how they are struggling with the camp life, with their depression, with all the tensions that they are facing in the camp. And unfortunately, the lockdown, it took even more months for us rather than the local people inside the island. So we raised up as a group, and we decided to talk about ourselves. While Sonia and Douglas, they were not here with us physically, but we could feel their presence all the time in any possible way. We had their support from the other country, and they were motivating us. They were connecting us to different journalist networks, and we could raise our voices from our side and involve people's voice as well in our reports. And we ended to contribute with many networks like Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, BBC Newsnight, and Guardian and SBS Deadline. And nowadays we are working on a production of documentary that we have the trailer that it's about nothing about us without us. So we have worked on this, and we are working still on it. So I'm inviting you to watch it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nazanin, Sonia, and Doug. We'll hand it over to Molly O'Toole.
I think
as people are hungry, yeah, for sure, people are hungry, and
audio sound, power banks, because there's no electricity available here, so we need to have power banks every day.
If they give them one answer that what's going to happen to them, everybody can be calm. In a film crew where different races gather together, and it makes me feel comfortable, and it makes me feel that we are all humans, and that's what freedom is about.
It's been over a year now since the fire destroyed Moria, since the media shifted away from Lesbos. Our collective hope was that we wouldn't be forgotten all over again, but that's exactly what's happening.
Absolutely powerful images. Thank you. We're now handing it over to Molly O'Toole.
It's so hard to follow. It's so hard to follow that. But I'm so happy to be here with this amazing panel. I don't want to take too much time because I'm so interested to get into our conversation. But I think in many ways we're in conversation already. Some of the things that my illustrious panelists have said, in terms of conflicting truths, prepare to be surprised. No one owes you their story. Nothing about us without us. We're all humans. That's what freedom is. But it also raises, interesting but difficult questions for me as a journalist. I work for the Los Angeles Times, based in Washington, and cover immigration and security policies, and what role of particularly U.S.-based journalists is in contributing to some of these narratives that can also harm communities. So from my perspective, as a US-based journalist, the stories that need to be told are holding the powers that be accountable by confronting our readers with the human consequences of US policy. And those stories need to be told whether it's Donald Trump in the White House or whether it's Joe Biden, because to a large extent, whether Republican or Democratic administrations, these policies have remained largely unchanged for decades. This prevention through deterrence idea. And despite decades of failure by these policymakers and politicians' own measure of success, which is stopping migration, these policies remain in place. But it is difficult to get it right. There are many obstacles in our path, none the least being the US government itself, which is not particularly interested in transparency or access to people or events that they deem might be potentially politically inconvenient or politically harmful to them. And so to try, in my perpetual struggle to try and get this right and do right by the people who are willing to share their stories with us, my guiding ethical principle that has somehow become political or even radical is empathy. I try to keep human beings, for example, migrants themselves, rather than, say, lawmakers in Washington who tend to be sort of old white men in suits with titles and ties. I try and keep human beings themselves at the center of the narrative. And what that does, I think, I hope, is to emphasize and focus on people's inherent dignity, their inherent humanity, which unfortunately has become a sort of a counterpoint to these policies and politics that seek to dehumanize them. I think a perfect illustration that I want to bring up, just to wrap up, is the situation that we're seeing in Del Rio, Texas, and Ciudad Acuña in northern Mexico, right across from Del Rio. These images are horrifying, yes, but once again, the quote-unquote media, which is a term I actually dislike because media is so diverse and disparate. You have media rushing to the area, using the language of crisis and surge and wave, which others have alluded to, and it feeds a sort of hyperbolic news cycle and political cycle. But this situation, which, while perhaps new in terms of the sheer numbers of people who are crossing, some of whom undoubtedly, and we have some anecdotal evidence for this, have made the journey north fairly recently. This situation is not new. I was in Del Rio and Ciudad Acuña in 2019. And at that time, President Trump had just threatened Mexico with tariffs, or essentially cutting off remittances unless the Mexican government did more to stop migrants from making that journey north and reaching the US-Mexico border. metering, this policy of essentially preventing people from their right under U.S. law to claim asylum, regardless of how they cross, whether at ports of entry or outside it. Metering was forcing people to wait onto wait lists that were thousands of numbers long. Remain in Mexico was in place, turning asylum seekers back, having them wait on their immigration court proceedings in Mexico. And thousands of people at that time in 2019, Haitians, but also Cubans, Cameroonians, Ghanaians, West and East Africans, were camped out in Ciudad Acuña, right across from Del Rio, forced to wait the quote-unquote right way at the border, even though at that time and since there was no quote-unquote right way, because ports of entry have essentially remained closed for, depending on how you measure it, 4 or 5 years now. And hundreds were crossing every day at that time. As well. And this is the direct result, this journey that people were taking that journalists have been treating as a new phenomenon. This was a direct result of both EU and US policies, essentially as pathways, legal pathways, were being closed. One of the only remaining pathways, which seems illogical, but is entirely logical when you think about that it's a direct result, consequences of policy, was essentially using the entire Western Hemisphere as a land bridge to the US-Mexico border, which was the only place where asylum could be claimed, beginning in Brazil and Ecuador, countries that had looser immigration requirements in order to get visas, and then essentially traveling northward from there. So this migration is not new. The situation is not new. But the tendency of media can be that we treat each situation outside of a broader context and consequence of U.S. policy. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of our conversation, and hopefully attempting to keep human beings sort of at the center of our work and of our conversation, while recognizing that there are human consequences to U.S. and global policy in terms of migration enforcement and attempts at deterrence.
Thank you so much, Molly. I'm handing it over to Robert Irwin.
Hi, I'm Robert Irwin, professor at UC Davis. I'm really grateful to be here. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to connect very directly with a lot that's been said already. There's a lot of confluence on this panel. I'm the coordinator of a project called Humanizing Deportation. It's a digital storytelling project. I'm going to show 2 clips during my presentation. We're going to start with one of them.
Los tamales están recién hechecitos. Yo los hago la mañana. Que sale el vaporcito. Y de elote y de plátano.
Hola, mi nombre es Esther Morales. Soy oaxaqueña. Me deportaron en septiembre del 2010, definitivamente después de 9 deportaciones. Fue la última, la cual decidí quedarme en Tijuana, donde actualmente radico y vivo y tengo un pequeño negocio y me dedico al activismo.
Just to give you a little bit of an idea of what our work looks like and the kind of people who participate in it. I'll refer back to this in a little while. But the Humanizing Deportation project is a project that is designed to collect, disseminate, analyze accurate, authentic, diverse, nuanced, qualitative data on who is affected by contemporary migration control and enforcement mechanisms in the US as well as Mexico, and how they are affected. And so what we are doing is producing an archive. We consider it to be a community archive of migrant experiences. Migrants recount their experiences, their feelings, their knowledge, and their politics. And the method that we use is digital storytelling. So this is a participatory community audiovisual mode. And so the stories, like you saw in that little clip, are audiovisual testimonial narratives. We're not documentary filmmakers. We don't have the resources of TV media or anything like that. We use a very DIY style, using very kind of everyday production software. And we produce the videos for diffusion on the internet, so they tend to be very brief. We try to make them maybe 5 to 7 minutes in length so that people who are surfing the internet won't get bored and move on to something else. We present no preconceived agenda. So these are not our stories. These are not the stories that are elaborating on the issues that we think need to be communicated. These are stories that the community wants to tell. And we kind of just give them a platform to tell the stories that they want to tell and raise the issues that they want to raise. It's a bilingual open access archive. We'll send you the address later, but Humanizing Deportation is easy to find in a Google search. The keywords for us are authenticity, and then in the stories, and the ownership. The stories belong to the people who tell them. And the history of the project goes back to right just before the elections. We actually did our training, our fieldwork training in Tijuana. It was like 3 days after the presidential elections. We were pretty shaken up at that point. But anyway, we launched our project in Tijuana in early 2017. We thought we were going to produce about 24 stories about deportation. We ended up with about 50. People had a lot more to say than we realized. We were able to expand through partnerships with a number of Mexican institutions to a number of other Mexican cities in the following year, and we produced a whole lot more. This was a little bit overwhelming as we were doing it. We never intended to be this big. We continued realizing the importance in late 2018 when we saw migrant caravans arriving in Tijuana and what all that implied. We started not just producing stories of deported migrants, but also migrants in transit, started working with undocumented migrants in California. We started working on Mexico's southern border, Tapachula, as well. And we continue to be active at the moment. It's been difficult during the pandemic, but you can see how big the archive is. 334 stories are contained there now. It's the world's largest qualitative archive of its kind. And it presents all kinds of present-day urgencies around human rights violations, things that we're seeing in the other talks related to migration law, policy, things that are being done, actions being taken at the U.S. border, as well as in Mexico. There's also an historical weight there as we work with different organizations and get some kind of emblematic stories of this historical moment into the archive, which includes, as I said, a breadth of material that you can see there at the bottom of the slide. And some of the activities that we're able to do with this, although we are a university project, we live on soft money. We go from grant to grant, so we never really know how much we're going to have in terms of resources, including human resources. But we have our website, and our whole process of production is really a kind of a community building process in a lot of ways, although the communities are often, that we work with are often in flux. We do dissemination via our website, but we've also done many public presentations, exhibitions, have gotten a good amount of media coverage. It's material that is used in teaching. It's very easy to use our archive in the classroom. Academic researchers are increasingly learning about it and incorporating this big database into their own research and analysis. Public policy recommendations have been drawn from it. And we've also been able to start collaborating with colleagues in the UC Davis Law School and offering legal counseling for people in Tijuana and other places. Here's another little clip to give you an idea more about what we do and our scope.
Soy un inmigrante. Actualmente mi documentación está en Honduras. Mi mamá biológica me regaló cuando yo tenía 6 meses a una señora salvadoreña. Ella me llevó con ella al Salvador, en San Salvador, y ella nos vendía sexualmente. De los 6 años empezó a traficarnos. Nos metía con un hombre, con otro hombre. Habían personas muy groseras, nos agredían, nos amarraban, o sea, nos hacían como ellos querían.
At the beginning of the story, I encourage you to take a look at our website. You can see these complete videos as well as many others. There are a number of other projects, affiliated projects that have emerged from our project over the years. One of our grad student members, Lisbeth de la Cruz, has an interactive mural. You may have seen this in the news. It's been really well covered in Tijuana, Playas de Tijuana. That includes barcodes If you scan the codes, it takes them to the digital stories on the Humanizing Deportation archive about these deported childhood arrivals, mostly deported. One of them wasn't. We've also worked with migrants from the caravan, including Douglas Oviedo, who wrote a book about his experience in the caravan called Caravaneros. You can buy this on Amazon. We helped him get it published in Mexico. We have a new project with the Red Franciscana para Migrantes called Migrar Informado es Migrar Más Seguro. It has to do with disinformation that circulates among migrants. We believe in migrant knowledge, but we also have discovered that migrants often move with knowledge that is really not helpful to them. It's information that they get informally, sometimes through human smugglers. What's happening with Haitians right now is really, really sad. A lot of them are coming not from Haiti, but coming from Chile or Mexico. I've been told that the Mexican the Tijuana-based Haitian population, which has been here since 2016, much of it has left and is now trying to cross the border into the U.S., and they're getting flown back to Haiti. Many times migrants don't realize what the facts are around their migration. We often are cheering for them to get across the border, when getting across the border just means they're going to get deported. And so anyway, we're working on an audiovisual project with this group to try to produce some materials to help migrants better understand their chances. We're also working with a grant from UC Berkeley on documenting what's been going on in Tijuana with migrants during the pandemic to help public health officials understand what should be done to protect migrants and protect the communities in which they live and stay. Anyway, there's a whole lot of stuff that we can talk about more. This is the address of Humanizing Deportation. Thank you all for inviting me to be here and to chat with you all.
Thanks so much, Robert. This is just a wonderful and important project. And I'm handing it over to our last speaker, Tanvi Misra. And please, audience members, you have a chance of asking questions in the chat, as after Tanvi's presentation, we'll move on to discussion. So Tanvi now.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It's so great to hear about all of your important work. And I think a couple of points that I wanted to make will very likely touch on some of the things that all of you have talked about. This week, I've been thinking about something that comes up time and again. For me as a journalist, I've been covering migration since 2013, sort of on a parallel track with my own immigration process to the United States. So that's been an interesting trip. But something that's come up for me time and again is how it is when events like what's happening in Del Rio take place, and images about those events sort of circulate and break through this noisy news cycle that sometimes, otherwise some of us are frustrated with, that our stories don't kind of make it across. And I've been thinking really hard about what that means, the proliferation of these images, most often images about migrant death and migrant distress. And on one hand, I absolutely have to agree that it's our duty to document, right? It's our duty to document and hold the governments that make these policies accountable, which means it's important for us to illuminate the harms that they do to vulnerable people. On the other hand, and increasingly, I've become very skeptical that an outsized focus on images like these, on incidents like these, really lead to lasting change. I've become very disillusioned with thinking about that, and honestly, just even seeing these images sometimes really angers me. I think for two reasons. One, because it often showcases just peaks in this graph of systemic abuse and violence. and in some ways also obscures the systemic reasons for that violence, that, then we're not able to really translate the complexity of what's happening and why it's happening the way it is. And the second reason is because this approach really portrays vulnerable people as masses, bodies and victims. And, I really wonder what the mass consumption of just seeing, a father and a daughter dead, drowned in the Rio Grande River, or other such images that have sort of really, gone viral in recent years. How that sort of perpetuates the dehumanization of immigrants, of people. And so for me, over this period of time, there's a couple of things that I've, keep in mind when I'm doing my reporting. And certainly I don't always get it right. We're all sort of just trying to, do it better each time around. But a couple of things that Molly and, Katie have already mentioned. But I think for me, I don't like to produce or share images that show violent images of migrants. I think it's re-traumatizing. And the reason I don't do that, I choose not to do that often, is because I think of my audience, no matter what it is that I'm doing, if it's an investigation that's geared toward changing laws in Congress, or if it's an analysis that I'm writing, I like to think that underneath it all, my core audience is immigrants themselves. And I want to be able to elevate conversations and reflect them accurately and not cause them any more harm than they might have already been through. And so that's something that I'm always trying to think of at the back of my head. There's this piece that I did for Roll Call, which I think the organizers would be pulling up a link shortly, where this really became an important question. It was a piece about suicide in an ICE jail. And I think for me, it was really important for the family of this person to drive what they wanted to share and what they didn't want to share. I think that was really important for me personally. And I think the other thing that I wanted to do with this piece, which I think brings me to my second point, is if I have to cover this landscape of trauma, I want to be able to balance it with aspects of these people that I'm covering that don't have to do with trauma. So this person was an artist, and I really wanted to include, the fact that people found him to be a really polite person, or that he and his brother used to spar all the time. I wanted to include those details in this piece because I wanted people to get to know who this person was, who he was as a brother, who he was as what he found joy in. And I think increasingly, I think probably this has accelerated for me after the Trump years. I've been trying to do more of that in my work. I think finally, something that I've tried to keep in mind is that there is just, and this always surprises me, even though I'm well acquainted with the ignorance around immigration policies and around migration itself as a phenomenon. I think I've tried to do stories that connect the dots between systems and geographies, and try to pull sort of the curtain back and reveal the long history of a particular, institution, or the broader context in which something is happening. And so, two pieces that I've done recently kind of touch on this. One is, and they're going to pull this up, so you'll be able to take a look. One is an analysis I did for the BAFLA, where I talked about, this phenomenon of all of these Indians coming to the border, the US-Mexico border, and why they're doing what they're doing, and why people are calling it a new phenomenon, which kind of touches on a point Molly made about how everything is sort of looked at in a vacuum. And then the second piece that I wanted to highlight really briefly is a piece that I did for Bloomberg City Lab, which is on the origins of immigrant detention. I wanted to sort of go through that history, but I wanted to do it through images. And further down in this piece, there is a little bit about that was very important for me to include, which is about how immigrants have always resisted, how they have documented their own stories, how they've written art, and how they've created art around their experiences. I think that was a really important element of this history that I wanted to include in this piece. Obviously, and everyone's already touched on this. This is the way that our industry works. It's not always easy to be able to achieve all of this in one piece. Certainly, the U.S. government doesn't make all of this easy. But I think we could do better by keeping in mind that migration doesn't start or end at the border, that it is an ongoing process. It starts much before, and it almost, sort of in some ways never ends. I also feel like, and this is particular to US news, that our newsrooms kind of worked in the way that they cover race and migration. They sort of silo these issues as if they don't inform everything else. And that frustrates me sometimes. I think the LA Times actually does a really good job of not doing that. I think there's a lot of, Molly covers immigration specifically, but I feel like it really infuses a lot of the other beats as well, and a lot of local reporting. But I feel like, something that I wish people would keep in mind, and I'll leave with this as sort of before we get into more of a discussion, is I wish that newsrooms and as consumers, we had a broader and more expansive views of what the border is, and the idea of borderlands, and start looking for boundaries that we draw between, immigrants and others, or whatever, sort of however you want to categorize, these groups, at various levels. And, whether that be at the city level, where you're seeing public health disparities. Right now, I'm doing a piece on the experiences of women in particular in New York City during COVID, and who've been completely overlooked. And that's a line, right? That's a line where they've had certain rights. They've not had certain rights that other people have, or certain types of assistance. But also legal and institutional boundaries, and sort of how they define who has access to rights and justice. And so I guess I'll just leave with that, and look forward to kind of unpacking all of this a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Tanvi, and everyone on the panel. Really, thanks so much for these interventions. And I feel like we're surrounded now by this whole set of common references and also really critical questions. Really appreciate it. From thinking about a few sort of threads that have come through your different sets of comments, challenging imagery and language of flows and waves, thinking about the convergence of tourism and migration and how these different movements live side by side or in friction, notions of conflicting truths. Many of you talked about how do we center people and people's experiences in these stories, and who owns these stories, who are they being told for, and who keeps them. Really interesting to me also are the other sort of related questions about how information travels. And then Tanvi, in your comments now, I think you've helped us really draw out some of the broader issues, recognizing really the complexity of issues of migration, how, as you said, they're interconnected with so many other aspects of our lives. And so the question of representation, I think is urgent, and also, as you've all been saying, gets at, it's just one window on this sort of impossible to represent complexity. So grappling with how do we get at that, and also then, if it's urgent, it's also timeless. So how do we think about telling these stories in ways that recognize the sort of constancy of these struggles, of these experiences, instead of treating them like they're sudden, unprecedented movements, especially in these hyper-politicized contexts. And as a panel, you've really addressed how these questions emerge through a range of media. So thinking from the newsroom to the archive, and many forms in between. And so I'm thinking across visual and textual media in particular, and would invite you to say more about how you see images and texts working together or in friction. Do you think we privilege the visual, or is that a particularly contentious point? Are some stories told better through one medium than another? And I'm thinking about these questions also in line with some of the issues that you've raised about how stories can objectify and racialize, but can also center human experience in critical ways. So I wonder how these issues come through for those of you working with a very quick turnaround. So thinking about, kind of imminent deadline that the newsroom might present, and how they might be similar or different for those of you working on longer term projects with the archive or in the production of a film. And so I'll just invite a couple of you to comment, but the idea here is also, feel free to jump in and respond to one another, and we'll get the conversation going. We're also getting great questions from the audience, so I'm trying to incorporate some of their observations into what I'm saying here too. So maybe I'll ask first Molly and then Nazanin to comment on the question of how you think about the importance of the visual or the narrative in this work, and thinking about the kind of media that you're using and making. Molly?
Sure. I tend to work primarily in print and primarily in words, which is somewhat ironic given my collaboration with This American Life and Emily Green of Vice on a podcast. I do tend to try and incorporate data visualization into my work. And then, of course, at the LA Times, I have the benefit of having some absolutely wonderful photojournalist colleagues to work with. So in each and every story, I think it's sort of a constant, or at least for me personally, it's sort of a constant struggle to try and represent the fullness and the complexity of an issue and of human beings on a deadline in a certain word count, making certain guesses about sort of what the attention span of our audience might be. So the way I try and tackle that and sort of, some people sort of refer to it, which sounds kind of trite, as getting people to eat their vegetables, or sort of Trojan horsing the information that you want them to get, or the takeaway you want them to get in other ways. I just try and incorporate several multimedia elements, so images, data visualization, the words themselves, and that's sort of the strategy that I employ. I think we've raised some really interesting questions here, and I'd be interested to know what others think, especially in terms of images. Images can be they can have such power that I can never convey in words, but there's obviously a risk to that as well, in terms of the sort of dehumanizing or racializing that we're talking about, at the same time that I think that we want to confront our readers, the policymakers, our quote-unquote audience, with the sort of inconvenient or grim realities of the situation on the ground, while not wanting to exploit trauma or exploit the or extract or commit a sort of extraction. That was a long-winded, and I want to hear what other people have to say, but who work primarily in visualization and in images and audio in a way that I don't, but admire.
Yeah, I'll pass it to Nazanin again, inviting others to comment too. But I wonder, Nazanin, if you could also comment on your work specifically with the visual. What is it that you are especially highlighting in this work, or how do you see it as working alongside some other kinds of narratives?
In my idea, both can be important as their own, as well the visual one and the narrative stories that they are sharing. I think they have their specific audiences. And for example, with the narrative, we can go through the details. That's maybe we are not so able to show it through the visual things and visual documentaries. So, I think with the social media and the approach of the media that's going on with the people, especially with the common people, that they are very attached with the social media. I think visual media can be important as well to show some things about the crisis that we have through the visual things. But the narrative things can be important more in academic way, that the people are more into reading things. For example, as I told, that they might have their own special audiences. And I think nowadays the common people, they are mostly into the visual things through the social medias and specific networks, but the narrative way more the specialist people and the academic ones.
Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a word about that. So I mean, we work in a very particular media that's not quite like what you see on the TV news or a documentary, right? So we're 5-minute long audiovisual production. And so these are narrators, migrants telling their own stories in what at least appears to be, and we try to make it a very unmediated way. So our voice is not there. They're telling their stories. And so in the reception of those audiovisual stories, what has been kind of most striking to us is that people can be very, very moved by them. And when they talk about being moved by them, a lot of times what they talk about is the importance not of the text nor of the image, but the audio. It's that person's real voice telling their story, sometimes getting choked up, sometimes starting to cry when they tell it, that really move people. And so I wanted to mention that as well.
Fantastic. So a related question, right? I think that that's coming up again and again, and that actually also came up in one of the questions from the chat, is really the question of scale, right? We have basically from the question of the power of individual stories to the power of the collective to the dehumanizing idea of like the graphic maps and data flows or refugees just being figured as masses, right? I think there's a really, really important question of scale there in terms of representation and impact. Of course, right, that's also a question of scale in terms of what we want these stories or these images to do, right? Help in a particular situation, help an individual to change policy on a national or even like on a global scale. And that brings me to another question, as we have, and it's still related to scale, since we have focused here mainly on two kind of like border hotspots and refugee hotspots. The question is really, how can we still be attentive to those specificities, to a context, but also maybe have a global, a comparative view and maybe learn from these situations, right? Myself as a German working in the US, right, I'm in a way implicated in both of these zones in an indirect way, right, as audience members of these stories. But it's interesting, right, to think of where your audiences are and how their position resonates with what your stories tell. So I think these are really some of the issues that have come up in all of your sharings and presentations. Maybe particularly Katie, right, since you were talking about the importance of the individual, Tanvi, right, resonating with the question of complexity, and maybe also moving it to a question of comparison between different regions and different so-called refugee crisis, maybe between Robert and the the, Refocus Media Lab group, just an invitation. Katie, do you want to start us off?
Sorry. Hello, everyone. I found the light switch to my room, which I'll be very delighted to hear. I think that's a really big question, and I think it's really important. And I think it's definitely a thing that I really struggle with. In some of this is situating it in a broader context. Also, this is also a sort of critique on the media and the way it's consumed and produced in these tight deadlines, and also increasingly narrow word limits. You know, sometimes I'll get given 600 words for a story, and it's almost, there's no way you can even describe the situation, let alone the sort of the scale of it and the way it relates to interconnecting things across the world and how things are happening. But I mean, for me, I think the most important thing is just knowing these limitations, and it will never be, not to sound sort of pessimistic, but I just think that it's never enough in a way. You can never describe, you can never contextualize enough. And I think that's also a good thing. There's always more you can do. There's always more you can say. And that's also just the scopes of the media, at least within I work, because I work often in news journalism, and I don't do a lot of multimedia. I don't do a lot of film, which I think, as they do at Refocus, can be really important in sort of bringing a broader context and a real sense of time and place to stories being told. Yeah, was that your question? I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or just creating an own answer to my own question.
Absolutely, and others are really welcome to chime in. So this is a question about scale, from the personal to the national to the global, and also the question about a comparison of these different scenarios, different regions, different, say, lives and experiences, and what you make of it in your work.
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
The BAFTA piece that I pulled up earlier was speaking to this question very directly. I think it's been very frustrating for me as someone who covers this topic in the United States and most often, but is familiar with what's happening in Europe, and then also what's happening in India. And there's a huge migration has been really politicized and weaponized here as well. I find it very frustrating that there is not enough global contextualization and connection. I really wish that as sort of, I don't know, as you know, people interested in this, as that be taking that as a very broad umbrella term, that everyone would do more of that. I find that not doing that really, it does the same thing that I said, that, sort of focusing on these very few, very sensational and horrifying images does, which is it obscures so much that could explain why things are happening the way they are, and why people are being treated as not being people, and I think this just goes back so far that I feel like if we did that, it would go some ways towards actually figuring out some real lasting solutions. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I think dependent upon, while the situations may be, we're talking about scale, but whether the story is large or small, while the details and the specifics of a particular story will be very unique, there's an overarching theme here, which is that the images that are being chosen and the stories that are being told are being determined by outsiders. And a part of the film concept that we've been working on with our team is what happens to the story when those that are inside it have a choice or have an ability to be part of the story's creation. And what what types of images would an insider choose? A lot of the exit interviews that we've conducted with our team in terms of what it was like for them to do this work during major crises moments on Lesbos, from fascist attacks that destroyed community centers to the lockdowns in the camps, to the fire that destroyed Moria, the homelessness on the streets, the new camp that people have now been living in for a year. The images that they tend to be chosen are being chosen by a producer or a photojournalist outside of the story. And there's been a consistent chorus from those inside it to say, well, we wouldn't have chosen those images because those images don't really tell the story appropriately. Or that they tried to question the idea of what are you trying to say? What is the inclusion of this image? How does it completely revolutionize what's really unfolding on the ground? And one in particular in our film, one of our team members, Kazim Jafri, he said he took real special note of the fact that in February 2020, there were peaceful protests against the conditions in the camp on Lesbos. And the image that went kind of viral through BBC was an image of a refugee throwing a rock at a police officer. It didn't show police officers throwing tear gas at women and children who were sitting in front of the line. And it didn't show the consistent just the consistent violence from the police towards people who were consistently using nonviolent means. That's not the image that went out, and then therefore that's not the story that was told. And a lot of them have been pushing back against that to say, well, if we had a say, if we had some influence, if we had some ability to be part of that collaborative decision-making process of how the story is constructed, how would that change the way the world sees this issue, and how would it change the way the world sees the people that are immediately impacted by the policies that they're kind of stuck inside?
Can I comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
First time. So I think it's a really, really interesting question. And so I can kind of try to imagine the difference between my situation and the one that Refocus is talking about, kind of producing a single product versus producing 300 micro products. And so there is a scale there in the Humanizing Deportation archive that's really interesting. It allows us to kind of get a weight of evidence around certain issues. For example, family separation as a result of deportation comes up again and again and again and again. It traumatizes thousands and thousands of people. We have really strong evidence to talk about that. But if we talk about, for example, the caravans of late 2018, the evidence that comes out in the narratives that caravan members tell is not necessarily kind of what you might expect. And so there's there's kind of two versions. There's a version that was coming up in right-wing media that they're criminals, they're dangerous, and all of this. And then in another kind of pro-migrant media that these are refugees, they're fleeing danger, they're really in really dire circumstances. And what comes up in the migrant narratives when they tell them themselves is actually kind of a mix. And so there's one narrative that talks about the fear that he felt because there was organized crime within the caravan. There were human smugglers there. No one was trying to get them out of there. And he even left the caravan for a period because he felt in danger within the caravan. But that's not the image that we want to get across to make the pro-migration message. We need a kind of a clean image where migrants are all poor refugees. And so anyway, what comes up when you have kind of like a mass of data is the complexities and nuances start to come out, which it can be helpful only if they're kind of interpreted in the right way.
Thanks. There's so much here to help us reflect on, again, this question of sort of the individual and collective and questions of scale. I want to wrap up with one final question, and that's also addressing something that several of you have brought up quite directly about how work like this, be it through news journalism or archival work, working directly with communities, how it does affect some kind of change and what that change might look like. And I'm going to direct this question at Krista, but invite everyone to comment again. Krista, as someone who's studying how these different narratives function, and maybe something about how they travel and what kinds of problems and possibilities they carry and open up, I wonder what your thoughts are on. Maybe the easy answer is we need all these kinds of stories, right? Like we need the complexity of narratives to be able to get at the complexity of the situation. But are there particular kinds of stories or representations that you think are especially effective for certain kinds of goals? Or what do you see as the different goals maybe that are entangled in this work?
Thanks. That's an amazing question. And I will defer to other people on the panel who probably have really interesting things to say about this. But I think one of the things that really drives me when I'm looking at images and stories and representations is around the question of the extent to which they confirm or challenge the division of the world into citizens and non-citizens. I think it's so crucial that we really don't begin with the idea that the migrant is an existing category and not a category of politics and of law. And that really influences the way stories are told, the scale, how we imagine relationships of belonging and unbelonging, how we imagine even forms of solidarity or empathy. We really have to work to not erase the way in which certain people are privileged by the structures of citizenship, but really reject the categorization of the world into citizens and non-citizens, which is why I think the goals of No Borders it has to be the thing that supports and holds all of the kinds of narratives. If we no longer think about citizens and non-citizens, then we have very different stories to tell. And the other thing I think that we need to do is move away from the relationship between mediated and unmediated as categories of thinking about this. It's all mediated, right? It's how it's mediated, and trying to really think about, well, what are the forms that can hold the stories in both their singularity and their collectivity. So not to generalize towards data, not to just say, well, everyone who's coming from Syria or everyone who's coming across the border from Mexico. What's the specificity that Robert's talking about here of individual stories, but not to remain at the level of the individual either, because these are structural collective stories that are world making, and they tell us something about the way the world moves and the barriers to that movement and how power operates. And I think the kinds of forms that really get at those questions in the way that Tanvi was talking about, I see as really potent and really powerful. And so I'm thinking of, for instance, the activist project by United of the list of documented deaths of refugees and migrants due to the restrictive policies of Fortress Europe. And it's a list, but it's a PDF. And so you count the number of pages, it's at 78 pages now, and it has the cause of death. So it tells little stories of each person, right? It's a table that refuses to be a table, that wants to honor every single death, that takes up the space of categorizing those deaths and of blaming them on Fortress Europe. It's a text-based thing, it's a data table, and yet it's a powerful, powerful activist tool for highlighting the ways in which these deaths are caused by detention, they're caused by border regimes, they're caused by exclusionary citizenship policies. And so I think all of these are really important things to hold in our toolbox as we're trying to think about representing the conditions of movement and the conditions of disenfranchisement and unbelonging that constitute the category of the migrant and the category of the citizen.
Thanks so much. Those are really powerful words to wrap up this panel with, I think. And you in the audience should be seeing also links to a few resources and to panelists' work. So these are resources that the panelists have recommended if you want to follow up on these issues, continue being in touch with these ideas. And we also, of course, recommend that you look at the work that our panelists have shared with you, which has also been linked, and you can find it again on the registration page. Thanks so much to everyone here, to the audience, to Andrea for co-moderating this with me, to all of you for the welcome, and to each of you on the panel for sharing this work and prompting us to think more critically about these questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.